As Gordon said there earlier, Tormod Machilane was an extraordinary person, and it was a privilege for me to know him. My only regret is when I came to know him first, my Gaelic wasn't that good at that stage. So I was able to listen to him all right, but I wasn't really able to participate at the level of social exchange. But he had extraordinary skills, qualities, and talents. Gordon has mentioned them: a piper, singer, actor, performer, writer, novelist. But also he was a very, very witty raconteur and a very astute observer of the human condition. And I think that's why his opinion of what happened to the Gaelic world is very important. He's basically, in that short clip, and I know the longer recordings are available to everybody, I'm sure people will want to look at them, but his astuteness in observing the transformations that have happened to the Gaelic world during his lifetime is very compelling, and it actually reflects many of the research findings and research insights in the book, the sociolinguistic survey we published last year, The Gaelic Crisis in the Vernacular Community. I took 5 things, basically, 5 points from what Tormod has set out there. The implications of the social change since the 50s, then the changes to the proportions or the social densities of Gaelic speakers in the last remaining vernacular social geography, that is mainly in the islands, in the Western Isles in particular. Then issues in relation to how the young are socialized in a minority culture in the context of language contact. In other words, their contact with speakers of a much stronger language. And then the difference between having a language competence and having a vernacular ease. In other words, that you have a comfortable facility to partake in an actual speaker group or a speaker community. So he hasn't studied these issues in a systematic way that many of us around the table here have studied, but he's come to a fairly accurate way of portraying and understanding what has happened to his own community. And I'll just say a few points on each of them before we open it up to a broader discussion. He talks of what has happened to the Gaelic community in his area, in the Isles, since the 50s. And this is quite a common theme in minority sociolinguistics, that we see the socioeconomic processes of modernization. These have been very disruptive for minority language groups in the sense that they are not able to manage the rate of social change in a way that protects their own social integrity. In other words, how do they maintain the integrity of the socio-cultural group and undergo modernization at the same time? There's a base that is a universal or a global theme of endangerment that many minority groups deal with. It's interesting also, he talks about the turning point in his culture from the 70s onwards. And we saw this in our own Gaelic crisis study. It's indicated quite clear from the census data on the proportions of Gaelic speakers in the islands from the 80s onwards. But our study, the Gaelic crisis study, actually indicated that this process started in the 70s. It became clear in the 80s, though. And that's brought us to the stage, if I can just talk a bit about the demolinguistics of the Gaelic crisis study. The speaker group, the vernacular speaker group in the Gaelic communities, is now around 11,000 people. But more troublesome or more worryingly is that the younger cohort that indicates an ability in spoken Gaelic is now below 2,000 people. So that 2,000 young people left in the vernacular context, and you can see where the issue of endangerment comes from there. If we move on then and look at the issue of the changes in the proportions of the social densities of the Gaels, in their social geography. And he makes this point that he thinks in his own community now that less than half the houses we could ascribe Gaelic speaking to them. That's probably an optimistic analysis, taking all of the Western Isles together. However, we do know that there is a bias in his area, Grimmassai, towards the more mature age cohorts, if I'm to put it delicately like that. And that ties in with his point also about people over 40, 50-ish being more comfortable in Gaelic than the other age cohorts. But it's interesting, if you thread together all the points he's making this link between a high social density of speakers, the home transmission of a minority language, the link beyond that then to the communal practice. In other words, if you have high densities of home transmission, then you are more likely to have a situation where the youth in that culture are socialized in the minority language. So he's showing great awareness of many of the key themes in sociolinguistic revitalization and regeneration for the threatened groups. Moving on then to this issue of how change happens. And he refers to this also, that generally change in minority groups happens through the introduction of new social players into a traditional society. And he refers to the social role of the lowland children in the playground of the schools in his area. And what we're seeing essentially there is that the bilingual Gael has been integrated into the monolingual social networks of the English dominant or the English speakers rather than the other way around. And we see this often in sociolinguistics, that the minority accommodates to the more favored language, to the majority language, rather than the other way around. And even to this day, there are obvious gaps in sociolinguistic insights that do not address that issue properly. Why is there one-way traffic in the language contact issues of how the majority group deals with the minority group? Moving on then, the implications for the minority culture for this issue of social subordination. So when you see a minority group accommodating to the requirements of the majority, you're essentially seeing the process there of social subordination. And it is in this context where we see what he means by this point he raises, that it's now exceptional to hear young people, children in his area, speaking Gaelic in a social setting. You might hear them speaking it in a school setting or in a cultural or performed setting, but the normal day-to-day vernacular use is now, for a man who grew up in a high-density social milieu of Gaelic speakers, he now finds it, he found it at that stage exceptional to hear young people speaking Gaelic. That links us to his final point, and it's a very, very important point, both for Gaelic culture and, again, a global issue of sociolinguistic importance for the revitalization or the continuity of the minority threatened groups. It's this difference between having a competence in a minority language and having a vernacular level social ease in a minority language. They're not the same thing. He makes this issue that the people over 40 who had experience of growing up in a social milieu of Gaelic speakers, they have much more ease in the day-to-day use of Gaelic. The under 40s then, who have less experience of seeing Gaelic being used in high social densities and in a wide variety of social domains, he feels that they do not have the same type of competence in Gaelic. Again, this is a very astute insight. Having a comfortable facility in the minority language comes generally, not always, but generally from being socialized in a high density of speakers. But what are the implications for today then in Thoromad's insights? I think the issue here for minority languages that are supported by public policy and public resources, in other words, projects of revitalization, if Thoromad, now, as I say, an astute observer of the minority culture, if he is aware of it, the academics are aware of it, it's obvious then that those in charge of public policy and public support mechanisms for the Gaelic group must be aware of it also. Why then do the insights that emerge from the community not filter down to the policy level, where the policy, people in charge of policy, people in charge of public bodies can interact and deal with the actual issues as they are understood and as they are felt in the community? What is this impediment in official promotion efforts that prevents or hinders official bodies from dealing with the reality? And this is, I use this medical metaphor often. If the doctors aren't allowed to make an accurate diagnosis, it makes it very difficult to come up with a compelling prescription. And this is part of the difficulty, that the level of communication between the people who live with the challenges and the people who prescribe the mechanisms to deal with the challenges is too wide. So I suppose what I'm asking for here, based on Thoromad's insights and astute observations, are that we need a more honest and debate and a closer relationship between community, academia, politicians, and people in charge of public bodies. We basically do not have that honesty at the minute to be able to devise more realistic mechanisms to help the speaker group in the actual crisis they live with. So I think I'll leave it like that, Gordon.